Great. Hello and welcome everyone to the second lecture in our Labor and Climate Change series run by Damon Silvers, the Professor of Practice here at IIPP. For those of you unfamiliar, I highly recommend that you look up Damon Silvers' very impressive biography, which I will not be able to do justice to. And for those of you who haven't seen the last lecture, I highly recommend you look at it. It helped bridge the conversations that we want to have on how state and workers can form a better relationship in an age of climate emergency. And the talk you're going to hear tonight is heavily embedded at this intersection from a more practical standpoint. And one thing that's very important to remember is that a lot of the stuff that you're going to hear tonight is things that are happening right now, or even made progress just last week. IIPP tries to bridge this intersection between theory and practice pretty intensively, and Damon is an excellent example of that. With that in mind, I would love to invite Damon down to start the talk.
Great. Thank you, Josh. All right, well, thank you so much, Josh, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Damon Silvers. I'm a visiting professor of practice here at the University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I have to give this disclaimer that obviously what I'm going to say is my opinion and mine alone, and not those of anybody who's paid me or whom I've been associated with, either individually or as an institution. This afternoon is the second of two lectures on, two public lectures on the labor movement, the state, and fighting climate change. This lecture really last week's lecture was really focused on this challenge and dynamic conceptually. This week's lecture is about how it is playing out, as Josh said, in practice right now across a number of democratic societies. And I'll just begin by saying that distinction, democratic societies, is very important. These issues exist in authoritarian societies. It's not that they're unique to democratic societies, and these dynamics exist in authoritarian societies, but they're much less transparent, right? So that I would have loved to have been able to do the kind of examination I'm going to do here of China, for example, but it's just much, much harder to understand and have access to what's going on. But believe you me, the issues are the same underneath. Now, let me begin by returning to a slide from last week. Where's my clicker? So I want to return to the conceptual framework that we're dealing with here, which is first that the nature of climate change as a problem, as an urgent civilizational problem, is really unsuited to, quote, market solutions, to sort of market fundamentalist, deregulated, financialized solutions. Those types of approaches have been tried for now really 40 years or more, since 1988, when climate change was first clearly identified as a problem. And they don't work. And they don't work for important reasons having to do with the nature of what climate change is, as an externality, as something that's heavily kind of backloaded as a problem that is contributed to locally but exists globally. Effective action against climate change requires intensive state deployment of technologies and the reshaping of markets. As we're going to learn today in detail, there's few problems better suited to IIPP's conception of market shaping than climate change. And markets as a truly multidimensional human phenomenon involving finance, labor, consumers, the state, and politics. In order to have the kind of effective state action that is necessary to fight climate change, particularly at this late hour, when dates like 2030, which are practically so close you can touch them, are the dates that science tells us we have to have radical action. The kind of state action that's required, that is comparable to the kind of reshaping of markets and societies that we see in an era, say, of total war, that type of action requires a broad social and political foundation, and that requires working people's support. And this type of support has to be organized in the context of powerful forces, both within societies and in the global political economy, that are trying to prevent action. Powerful forces in terms of large energy corporations, the political parties that are allied with them, and powerful forces in terms of those states, those governments, those nations, which are disproportionately dependent economically on fossil fuel production. So you have opposition here. And in order to defeat that opposition, you need to have a real organization of political power behind your agenda. Now, last week we talked about what is necessary in terms of government response, government policy in relation to working people for climate change policy to succeed. The three elements, and I use slightly different words because I'm not all that disciplined, the three elements of what is required that we see from looking across countries and across time frames is one, leadership. Governments defining what the policy goals are, both in terms of the ultimate goals with climate, but also in terms of how labor fits into those goals for shaping labor markets in the context of fighting climate change. Leadership, one. Two, money. There's a couple of free seats up here. Money. Lots of money, not token amounts of money, but money sufficient to retrain, to create new job opportunities, to rebuild regional economies, large amounts of money. And third, and most importantly, is engagement, is processes of social dialogue with working people, their unions, their community leaders, and their political parties. This third, in the research that I did several years ago, looking back at climate policy in the 20-teens, it was clear to me that this one, engagement, is really what defines the difference between success and failure. I would put it at the top, although money certainly counts, as we're about to learn. Now, this lecture focuses on what has happened across a group of democratic societies in both the developed and the developing world since 2022. But I want to remind you, because it's an important framework, what I talked about in my lectures 2 years ago about climate policy before 2020 and the striking contrast between the success of the German coal deal, which created a process for closing the German coal industry, one of, historically, along with Britain's, one of the earliest and most profoundly socially rooted coal industries in the world. The process for closing the German coal industry, which successfully concluded in 2019, not the closure, but the political process, and is in place today, has not collapsed politically or led to the rise of the far right at a level that Germany can't handle. The German coal deal is in place today. In contrast, the French petrol tax that the Macron government put in place in 2019, which occurred without the kind of intense social dialogue that the German petrol deal did, the German coal deal did, and without the money that the German coal deal deployed to rebuild coal-dependent communities. So France put a petrol tax on without building up its rural bus service, for example. And the result, as those of you who were around in 2019 will remember, was massive social unrest in France, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, and the collapse of the petrol tax. Now, we're going to look today at 4 countries and how they have responded to climate change, how their governments, their states, have responded to climate change as a policy matter since 2022, and the relationship of that response to the labor movements in these countries. Right? And the 4 countries are and I'm going to go through them in order: the United States, Brazil, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And there's a reason for this order. The United States is the most striking case. And obviously I'm an American, I know a bit more about it than the other 3, but it also really illustrates, I think, with great power, the thesis that I'm laying in front of you. And of course, the United States is the world's most powerful country. The fact that these events are happening there has consequences everywhere. Brazil is one of the world's largest countries. It's a rising society. It is one of the more successful democracies in the developing world. And what's happening in Brazil is, I think, of comparable importance to the United States. South Africa is a society that illustrates the challenges, together with Brazil, of trying to accomplish rapid, ambitious climate change in a world of fiscal constraints. Right? And this is a theme, this is where we're going to end, right, is that issue. And there's no country that more, I think, defines that issue than the one in which we're all sitting in, which is the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom will be the final case study. Now, with that, let's talk about the United States. When Joe Biden was elected president, and you'll see that there are two, the United States and Brazil have this in common. They just went through transitions from essentially climate-denying governments to aggressive governments who committed to aggressive action on climate change. And simultaneously, those same governments were a transition from governments that were relatively hostile to their national labor movements to governments that were very friendly. Now, in the United States in 2021 and 2022, the Biden administration passed 4 landmark pieces of public investment legislation. The American Recovery Act, which has kind of been forgotten, but which was the first of the 4, and was actually the largest. At $1.9 trillion, moved out roughly over a 36-month period. It's often not described as a public investment act, but almost $500 billion of it went to local government, much of which would be characterized by economists as public investment. And critically, in terms of what we're talking about, $80 billion of it went to stabilize worker pension funds that were, don't want to do that again. $80 billion of it went to stabilize worker pension funds, which were the process of collective bargaining, and which had become, the deregulation of certain industries had weakened key funds in the structure. The US labor movement was despairing that there would be a solution. In the American Rescue Plan, the Biden administration, as one of its first acts, completely solved this problem with no benefit cuts. Right? A dramatic act that didn't get a lot of attention, but certainly did in the labor movement, which goes to the thesis of these lectures that if you want to fight climate change, you need to treat working people well. You need the state to treat working people well and to involve them in that fight. But it's not just the climate-related things you need to do. It's a broader set of policy attitudes and direction. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this is called in the American political discourse the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. This law got very significant Republican support. $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investment over 5 years, between 50 and 100 billion of which is directly climate related. For example, yesterday they broke ground on high-speed rail from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, a project that has been discussed for about 30 years. They actually put shovels in the ground yesterday. You can look at it on Pete Buttigieg's Twitter feed. That was funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Right. $1.2 trillion. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a peculiarly named bill, the reason why it's called the Inflation Reduction Act is because it is fully funded by increased tax revenues and decreased spending that derive from 2 things: funding the Internal Revenue Service properly and reducing prescription drug costs by allowing the government to bargain with pharmaceutical companies. So the funding of this bill is highly progressive. And the theory of the bill is that it reduces inflation by increasing supply, in particular energy supply. It's a progressive supply-side piece of legislation. The Inflation Reduction Act, $891 billion, of which almost all of it is climate-related, $783 billion. Now these are immense. I just want to say this, I'm going to say this again. These are immense sums. huge. They dwarf anything in American public policy other than war in my lifetime. And finally, the CHIPS and Science Act, which is smaller, $280 billion over 10 years, but it includes critical investments in climate technology, in climate science, in laboratories, in sort of cutting-edge ideas that are almost certainly going to be needed as we accelerate the fight against climate change over the next several decades. The punchline in the United States, the punchline in the United States, $3.3 trillion, 12.5% of GDP in public investment, $1 trillion of which is focused on climate specifically. Much of the rest of it has some climate connection, but $1 trillion is really sort of aimed at climate change, which amounts to 1.3% of GDP over the first 5 years of these bills on a flatline basis. In reality, the money is sort of front-loaded for a variety of reasons, but it's essentially 1.3% of GDP in federal public investment spending across the U.S. economy going forward for the next 5 years. First, just from a pure kind of full employment perspective, which is a critical objective of any labor movement, this is a dramatic act. It essentially ensures full employment both across the U.S. economy. I mean, absent really destructive public policies, which you can't rule out, absent destructive public policies, this spending will ensure full employment in the United States for years to come, and particularly in construction and manufacturing, which has broad benefits to working people and cements political relationships between the labor movement and the state. Now, even more importantly, in terms of what we're talking about, the Biden administration and the Congress that passed these pieces of legislation embedded labor policies in the investment. The three things, they did two things, and they didn't do one. And the fact that they did it this way has everything to do with what you've seen in the American labor movement and American labor events over the last couple of years. So first, all of these bills require that construction workers be paid prevailing wages. And prevailing wages are generally, in some sense, shaped by union contracts. They require that all the construction workers working with this money be paid prevailing wage, and that the construction contractors must support robust training programs. There are also training program requirements for the factories that make the chips in the CHIPS Act. What there isn't, secondly, there are made in USA requirements for the supply chains feeding all of this work and for the electric vehicles that have tax subsidies in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is highly controversial among the United States' trading partners. But from the perspective of the American trade union movement and American workers in the manufacturing sector, this is a very important requirement. However, there is no explicit labor rights provisions, meaning no higher minimum wage provisions. The general minimum wage laws apply. There's no higher minimum wage provisions. There's no right to organize provisions. There's nothing like prevailing wage. There are no benefits requirements, with the exception of child care in CHIPS, for the manufacturing workers. And the reason why there's no requirement there, because it was in the original legislation in the IRA, the reason why there is no requirement is because the last vote in the United States Senate for the IRA was U.S. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. West Virginia has a large non-union auto factory, a Toyota factory. Toyota is union all over the world, but not in West Virginia. As the United Auto Workers likes to say in the United States, Toyota thinks that West Virginians are somehow less deserving than the rest of the people who work for them. Joe Manchin did Toyota's bidding in that negotiation, and so there are no labor rights for manufacturing workers. But what I think Joe Manchin and Toyota didn't anticipate was that, and we'll come to this in a moment in greater detail, as I talked about in the last lecture, this situation of there being no labor rights for manufacturing workers in the IRA contributed to an explosion. a national U.S. auto strike, and a wave of organizing by the United Auto Workers across the American South in foreign-owned auto companies. Now, if those are the labor policies, what about the climate policies? And what I mean here is the climate finance policies. These are very important choices that were made in the Biden administration's investment agenda, which have some upsides and some downsides. And they have consequences, as we'll see in other countries. They have consequences for how working people perceive what happens. So first, the majority of the funds in the Biden investment agenda that are climate specific, not the highway funds and not the rail and not the high-speed rail funds, but the funds that support electric vehicle factories, battery factories, windmills, solar panels, all of that sort of thing, are in the form of tax credits, not in the form of direct public spending or conditional grants. For those of you who are familiar with IIPP's kind of whole framework for thinking about government support of innovation, tax credits make conditionality difficult. Because in the US tax system, to claim a tax credit, you just have to file your tax form. Unless there's a specific conditionality associated with it, you get to claim that credit by right. And if the government wants to contest whether or not you actually did what you were supposed to do, they have to come back and try to claw that money back from you. It's very, very different than a loan or a grant where there's an actual application process. Much of the remainder, besides grants, is in subsidized loans. Now, subsidized loans are a good thing, but they require that private capital step up with equity. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about why that is problematic. But I should say first that it's really important to understand, particularly those of you who are thinking about UK public policy, how crazily successful this has been as just raw economics. And by crazily successful, I mean, look at this graph. This graph is inflation-adjusted private manufacturing spending in the United States. And those of you whose glasses may not be up to date, it just goes straight up in 2023. It sort of bounces around for decades, because this is from 1964. And then it goes straight up. Private manufacturing spending on a monthly basis has tripled in the United States. Private manufacturing construction has tripled month to month from February 2021 to February 2024. It's an astounding outcome. The only thing that resembles it is what happened in the US at the beginning of the Second World War. Secondly, total clean energy investment is up 38% from 2022 to 2023, and now stands at $239 billion on an annual basis in the United States. That, by the way, is a huge number. It's a huge number. It would be as if, for a UK comparison, that's 10% of UK GDP. Now, the problem, though, there are three problems. As I said, first, this approach, tax credits plus subsidized loans, makes it hard to have strong conditionality for labor or for issues like getting a return back to the public for public investment. Secondly, there's a targeting problem. Right? As we Americans like to say, it's a shotgun approach. You're basically funding anything anybody wants to claim has anything to do with fighting climate change. If we think about how much climate change is driven by three things, the large-scale built environment, how we generate electric power, and transportation, cars. If you think about that, it might be that we would want to target things very carefully. Right? This is not that kind of targeting. And third, and this has turned out to be really problematic, it results in a program that's vulnerable to interest rate fluctuations, because you've got tax credits and subsidized loans stacked on top of private capital. and the private capital needs a return. And as interest rates rise, your subsidy structure is not going to be enough to get the private capital the return they are looking for. By contrast, if the capital stack was public dollars all the way up and down, you wouldn't have that problem. Right? Now, on the other hand, you wouldn't be leveraging private money, right? But what we're seeing right now, unfortunately, with interest rates, with risk-free rates in the United States now at 5% short term, we're seeing a number of projects being either put on hold or canceled because the rates of return don't work for the equity capital underneath. This is particularly true with wind projects. Right? That vulnerability is something that's worth thinking about both in other countries like the United Kingdom and in the next round of U.S. climate investment, which hopefully we will have in the next 18 months or so. Now, the second problem is that it's turning out, and this is a very IIPP type issue. The second problem in the United States is that it's turning out that market shaping turns out to be a bigger job than people thought initially. It's not sufficient to simply give tax breaks to companies to build electric cars. People have to buy them. People have to buy them. And you have to have a sense in the country as a whole that the project is benefiting the American economy and American workers. So electric cars have to at the same time be affordable and be made in the US and pay high wages. And this is a challenging thing when you have countries that pay a lot lower, like for example, China. So coming back to my point before, US passenger vehicle emissions are 29% of total US emissions. That's a significant global fact. 2, the Biden agenda has succeeded in doubling sales of electric vehicles since 2021. This is a monthly number. They went from roughly 40,000 to close to 100,000 a month. But total US vehicle sales are 10 million a year. So this type of increase has to be sustained, and the evidence is that it's slowing. This is against the fact that average US car prices have risen dramatically in recent years. They are now, the rise is actually before this graph, but average US car prices are now $47,000 for a new car. It's an enormous amount of money given that US median income, family income, $76,000. US electric vehicles, median average cost today is roughly $52,000, $54,000. So it's a bit more. The tax subsidy is enough to bridge that difference between the average gasoline-powered car and the average electric car, assuming that these averages really are relevant. There's an issue about average and median here. But Chinese EVs sell for almost $20,000 cheaper on average than US EVs, $32,000 roughly. And the Biden tax credit of $7,500 is just not $20,000. In response to this situation, Donald Trump has proposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown, the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, has suggested that we ought to have a total ban on Chinese electric vehicles in the United States. Sherrod represents Ohio, which is a major steel and auto-making state. And Sherrod's argument is that the Chinese manipulate trade and engage in profound human rights violations in the supply chain. I'm not expressing an opinion about those ideas, but I will note that this whole picture tells you that if you want to have a politically sustainable move to electric vehicles in the United States, policymakers have to think about a lot more than simply essentially subsidies to capital. They have to think about how this looks to consumers, about how it looks to workers, and about how it plays politically in key parts of the United States, if you want to get the job done. Market shaping turns out to be a much more intense and ambitious project than it appears on the surface. And by the way, what's the precedent for this kind of thing? Wartime. Wartime. When the world's major economies were engaged in the Second World War, every one of them did that type of thinking, both around military procurement and around managing their economies as a whole. Because when you have to get someplace, and we have to get there on these emissions issues, this is the only way to do it. Now, what is the political shape of the Biden investments from the labor movement's perspective? Going back to remembering these criteria of engagement, money, and leadership, there was and has and is extensive consultation between U.S. trade unions and both the Biden administration and the congressional leaders who framed these laws, both about the drafting of the laws and about the implementation. Does that mean the unions have gotten everything they wanted? No, I just talked to you about Joe Manchin. But it does mean that this process of intense engagement and buy-in has occurred. 2, there was clear leadership around the good jobs objectives of the Biden investment agenda. Every time the president got in front of a camera, he would say, my goal in these investments is to create good jobs. And often he would say good union jobs. The leadership could not have been clearer on the jobs element. On the climate element, however, it's a little vaguer. All right? The president and his administration are completely committed to fighting climate change, but you don't often hear them say exactly why. In my view, this would have more public support if they were clearer about the why, about the urgency, as I discussed in the last lecture. This is not about saving polar bears. It's about saving us and our civilization, our economy, our children's future. Finally, money. I think I've made clear the level of money involved in this is unprecedented. Nothing in living memory. You'd have to go back really to the 1950s and early 60s, which is just sort of inside living memory, or even to the 1930s, to find something on this kind of scale. The money is there. And the contrast with prior efforts in prior administrations in the United States is like night and day. Now, what are the political consequences of this? The political consequences are very significant. The construction and manufacturing unions in the U.S., which are politically situated in states that are critical to both the control of Congress and the presidential election, have shifted their orientation, both economically and politically, from oil and gas to renewable energy, public transport, and manufacturing plant construction. Why have they done that? Because that's where the work is. All of a sudden, there's $3 trillion worth of work in these spaces. And it's work on good terms, particularly in construction. Secondly, and this is really striking, and you don't see much commentary about it, there's been a de-escalation in conflict within the Democratic Party between trade unions and environmental advocates over climate issues. Now, it's not to say they agree about everything, but the temperature has been turned way down. And there's lots of more collaboration than there is fighting. And the contrast with what was going on, say, in 2014 or 2015 or 2016 around pipelines and various other things is quite dramatic. In fact, most people have kind of forgotten that all that happened. Nothing like $3 trillion worth of jobs. And then there's been a dramatic rise in the intensity of political support for Biden by construction and manufacturing unions. And I can say that, but I want, like Wittgenstein once said, probably nearby, I want to show it to you. I'm going to show you a little video. The voice you hear speaking is a man named Sean McGarvey, who's the president of North America's Building Trades Unions. He's one of the most powerful labor leaders in the United States. He is not a partisan Democrat. I think Sean would say that he's a trade unionist and the politics flow from there. If you listen to Sean and look at the imagery that they're showing you. Can we roll the video? By the way, this is only half of this endorsement ad. The other half I leave to you to watch.
The president signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, CHIPS and Science Act.
The landmark Inflation Reduction Act.
Hard-fought victory for the president.
These massive pieces of legislation have been passed. It's incredible, but it isn't like Schoolhouse Rock, okay? There's lots of work to be done after the president actually signs a bill. They can write the rules so the rules work for working people. They can write the rules so the rules don't work for working people. The language that President Biden put in the legislation, he's got everybody covered. Forgot about nobody. It's been amazing.
15 million new jobs in just 3 years. 800,000 new manufacturing jobs in America and counting.
So many times we were promised, and then nobody really delivered. Once again, somebody comes in and promises, only lo and behold, delivering. I think we'll step back from where we're at in a few years, and we'll realize how big the impact of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has been. With the monumental pieces of legislation that they passed that are just now starting to take root from coast to coast in this country. The future is so bright, it's unbelievable. We're bringing domestic manufacturing back. We're going to get broadband for the first time in huge swaths of this country. President Biden fixed our pension funds to make them even more solid for the future. Like they say, rising tide lifts all boats. By the time Biden's done his second term, anybody that wants a middle class living in this country is going to have the opportunity to have one, whether it's in construction or someplace else. This is all made possible through the work that he's done, working with leaders in Congress to set the table for the renaissance of the American economy.
Towns that have been forgotten and left behind for dead are coming alive again because of you all and what we're doing. Finish the job. We are the United States of America.
North America's building trade unions couldn't be more proud or dedicated to the endorsement of Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris for President and Vice President of the United States of America. We will use everything at our disposal in our quest to have Joe Biden reelected as the President of the United States. You can count on NAP2 getting it done.
I show you that because there's nothing like that from the 2020 election, from the 2016 election, the 2012 election. This is a unique artifact in American politics in our time. And it's the consequence of the intensity of it. Not the fact that they endorsed, but the intensity of it and the way they describe it is an artifact of, it's a consequence of the way in which the Biden administration has connected the Biden administration's commitment on climate change to its commitment to public investment, to its commitment to workers. Right? And we will, of course, see what exactly happens in the election. But I can just tell you, there isn't anything like that before. Now, by contrast, what's happened in manufacturing? The absence of clear labor standards in manufacturing set off an intense conflict in the auto industry, because the auto industry is where this game really is at. Right? And in the auto industry in the United States, you have 50% of the industry unionized with relatively high wages and good benefits, and 50% operated by non-US auto companies, largely in the South, non-unionized, lower wages, fewer benefits, and no voice. The non-union companies began claiming the Biden tax credits. The unionized companies set up non-union affiliates, so to speak, joint ventures with third-party companies, often battery manufacturers from South Korea and Taiwan, and tried to operate non-union. That produced this. The underpinnings of the strike last fall was the determination of the United Auto Workers not to let the unionized companies, Ford, Stellantis, and GM, shift production in the electric vehicle sector to non-union, double-breasted entities. The first picture here, as we talked about last week, is a picture of the workers at the GM affiliated battery plant in Lordstown, Ohio. Remember Sherrod Brown being from Ohio. they had worked in a GM assembly plant. That plant was closed. GM opened a battery plant across the street, paid half the wages. They launched a campaign, eventually got the Biden administration on their side, and won essentially similar wages. UAW went on strike nationwide. One of the clear demands, there were some legal complications around making these demands publicly, but one of the clear demands was to end the double breasting, was to end the creation of these non-union subsidiaries. They won that strike with Joe Biden on the picket line. The auto workers went from there to a massive organizing campaign across the South, energized by the fact that Southern workers figured out that the unionized workers had just gotten effectively a 30% pay increase, which they hadn't gotten. The UAW won the first election at Volkswagen in Tennessee. This plant is converting to making electric vehicles. Right? This election, as was just noted in the New Republic today, this election connected the transition to EVs to the growth of the Southern labor movement. The next election will be at Mercedes in a week in Alabama. Now, this intense conflict, which by and large the United Auto Workers is winning, this wasn't actually necessary. This could have been dealt with by having the original labor provisions in the IRA. Right? But this is, I would call this the Joe Manchin memorial explosion of the labor movement. Now, here is the macroeconomic outcome that we talked about last week that I want to come back to. Both in climate and in economic terms, the Biden investment agenda with its strong pro-worker tilt seems to be working. How do we know this? This graph shows you, I showed this graph last week, I'm going to show it again, it's so important. It shows you GDP growth and net greenhouse gas emissions. And because of COVID, you get all this kind of crazy noise here. What happens for the first time really in a serious way as a result of the Biden investment agenda is that in 2023 you see significantly rising GDP growth at 2.4% and declining greenhouse gas emissions. Now that was true back here in 2019, but this is the result of the substitution of natural gas for coal for economic reasons in the American electric power generation system. That's not what this is. The natural gas transition has largely happened. This is the impact of the beginning of the $3 trillion. And what it shows is, contrary to what a lot of people on the more right side of the political spectrum have said, it shows that you can have green growth. An absolutely critical outcome, which is continuing as far as we can see in 2024. And by the way, this is a level of growth, 2.4%, that Rishi Sunak would give his right teeth for, as I said last time, maybe his left teeth too. From the US story, we want to move to Brazil. Now, Brazil is a story, as the headline says, of worker power and climate change in an emerging market superpower. Brazil is the world's 8th largest economy and 6th largest carbon emitter. Now, that fact should give you pause. It is true, but not often said, that what happens in the world's poorest countries is not that important in the climate fight. We do not have to force the world's poorest countries to stop developing in order to effectively fight climate change. But it is absolutely critical that the world's emerging market superpowers effectively fight climate change. And this is true both because of their broad impact as large, increasingly affluent societies, and it's also true because they, like developed societies like the United States, are large producers of fossil fuels. So what happens in Brazil, as you can see by the 6th largest emitter, what happens in Brazil really matters in terms of the global outcome. And Brazil is a fascinating situation, just understood conceptually. It's really very, very complicated in some ways more complicated than the United States. Right? So Brazil includes, as everyone knows in relation to climate, the Amazon, a key global store of carbon, which is under severe pressure from agricultural interests. Although, you know, it's funny, this map here of the Amazon, which shows the places where deforestation and slash and burn agriculture is going on, gives you a bit of a sense of the scale of the place, right? There's been huge damage, but look at it. It's sort of, it dwarfs the places where these things are happening. It's just that we know if they're allowed to continue, it won't dwarf them anymore. So it includes the Amazon. Brazil includes Petrobras, the state-owned oil company that dominates Brazilian oil and gas production. And Brazilian oil and gas production is non-trivial. Brazil is on track to become the 5th largest oil-producing country by 2030. Now, by the way, before anybody gets too outraged, the United States is number 1. Right? Number 1. Hydropower. This is the giant dam in southern Brazil, whose name I am blanking on, but it's one of the world's largest hydroelectric dams. I'm sorry? Yeah, there we go. It's truly one of the world's marvels. Brazil's power grid is about 80% hydroelectric. And Brazil has the potential to be a renewable superpower. What does that mean? It means that there's a lot more untapped hydropower in Brazil. Brazil is an enormous tropical landmass. The solar potential, Brazil has a multi-thousand-mile coastline. The solar power, the wind power, the hydropower potential of Brazil is gigantic. And that kind of electric power can be sent to other countries. It can be turned into hydrogen. It can be an entire new sort of industrial revolution. And Brazil is a huge society with industrial, transportation, and household emissions like any other huge middle-income country. But the thing about decarbonizing countries is that the technologies aren't cheaper because you're middle income rather than upper income. It requires large capital investments to decarbonize. And like the UK, Brazil has limiting fiscal targets. Brazil's governing apparatus is deeply committed to meeting those fiscal targets. Brazil has had a traumatic history with inflation, currency instability, right? And the question is, how? Now, workers' political power has been central to the climate policy story in Brazil. In 2003, the Workers' Party came to power in Brazil, led by Luiz Inácio da Silva, who everyone knows as Lula. This doesn't get enough attention, but Lula is an auto workers leader. Lula, as a young man, went to the state of Sao Paulo, literally on the back of a pickup truck to work in an auto plant, and founded an independent union that took on at that time, Brazil's military dictatorship. That union gave birth to the CUT, Brazil's largest labor federation, and ultimately the Workers' Party, which under whose flag Lula won the presidency in 2003. Lula was succeeded by his protege, Dilma Rousseff, who was then impeached by right-wing Brazilian political forces in 2014, an event that many Brazilians viewed as a coup. Her vice president succeeded her, who was kind of a nothing, and he was succeeded in a context of economic instability and social instability. He was succeeded by Jair Bolsonaro, a former military officer who was openly sympathetic with Brazil's former military regime, and who attacked labor rights, privatized major energy companies, pushed to open up the Amazon to more agricultural development, and was an active climate denier and also a vaccine denier, which turned out to be a somewhat self-destructive thing for him. As I said, Bolsonaro was pro-deforestation in the Amazon, and he radically reduced Brazil's carbon emissions targets under the Paris Accords. Under Bolsonaro, Brazil was an active collaborator with countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, in a global effort to stop action on climate change. Bolsonaro is not in power in Brazil today because of the organized political power of working people in Brazil, something achieved over decades involving terrible sacrifice, but for which Bolsonaro's agenda of destroying the Amazon would be continuing apace. Instead, because of workers' political power, Lula defeated Bolsonaro and returned to the presidency in January 2023, pledging to reverse Bolsonaro's climate-destroying policies. So what are Lula's policies? Now Lula's in power. Lula restored Brazil's 2015 emissions targets, the original ones, in 2023. A 50% reduction off of 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Extremely ambitious targets. Lula reversed Bolsonaro's Amazon policies. This is the area where really he has been most aggressive. He restored the Amazon Fund for Alternative Economic Development instead of land clearing. He deployed the police and military to stop illegal deforestation, including elite paratrooper units. And he empowered indigenous peoples in a variety of ways, appointing indigenous representatives to his cabinet and engaging with indigenous communities in policymaking around the Amazon. More broadly, he committed to intensive citizen consultation as part of Brazil's overall public investment process. That's my engagement part. Now let's talk about the money, right? The money. Last summer, 6 months or so into Lula's government, Lula announced something called NovoPAC, which was Brazil's national government investment program. Now, by the way, before I get into this, I have to have this little caveat. The caveat is that IIPP is actually involved in this. I'm not personally, but a number of my colleagues and our director, Mariana Mazzucato, have been advising the Brazilian government on aspects of this program. So that's just, so you know. All right. So what is NovoPAC? NovoPAC is the sort of equivalent in Brazil of the Biden investment agenda. $74 billion in US dollars in federal government funds, 3.75% of GDP, designed to leverage $350 billion of total investment, the balance coming from the private sector, 17% of GDP over a 4-year period. 111 billion US of this money is designed to be climate related. Of critical importance, and we'll see how this plays when we come to South Africa, the ability of Brazil to engage in public investment on this level is the consequence of Brazil having institutions designed to do it. Most importantly, the Brazilian National Development Bank, the BNDES, and a large number of state-owned enterprises that can be coordinated around a shift in capital investment in the direction that the Lula government wants to go. Coordinated imperfectly, but it can be coordinated. This comes back to my point earlier that climate change cannot be effectively fought on the scientific timeframes that we're dealing with without this type of coordination. And to sort of wait around for financial markets to think it's a good idea is the end of civilization. This spending is then supplemented by another $60 billion US, 2.6% of GDP, in other funding directed through Brazil's explicit industrial strategy, something called the Nova Industria Brasil program in that space. I think you'll note that these numbers are in the same zone as the Biden numbers. Right. However, oh boy. All right, I'm going to warn you guys, I'm going to run about 10 minutes over. All right, so the Q&A will be 20 minutes instead of 30. And Josh here is going to police me. But at the same time as these investments were announced, and as Lula made these substantive climate changes, they also announced expanded investment in oil and gas production, an expansion in Petrobras's operations, and an expansion in projected total oil and gas production from Brazilian sources. Now, at the same time, the Lula government moved to orient Brazil's labor policies away from where Bolsonaro had been. In the first year of Lula's government, they raised the minimum wage, they passed an equal pay statute for women, they passed labor rights for platform workers, they resumed active policies of social dialogue with trade unions around economic policy. Trade unions, by the way, are built into the governance of the BNDES, of the Brazilian National Development Bank. And the Brazilian National Development Bank is funded in large part by a payroll contribution from Brazil's workforce. And finally, in something that was like utterly shocking, if you think about where things were, say, in 2019, Brazil and the United States entered into a labor rights compact in which they both pledged to work together to lift up the power and voice of working people in their respective societies, and in particular around climate change. However, Brazilian trade unions say, quietly, that there's inconsistent levels of social dialogue in all of this industrial strategy, particularly around climate change. And I hope you'll begin to see that this is a common thread. Political leaders, Joe Biden, President Lula, we'll talk about Cyril Ramaphosa in a moment, political leaders set a general direction. It doesn't mean that their bureaucracies are going to follow, at least not consistently. And secondly, the Bolsonaro-era energy privatizations remain in place. The energy privatization is the actual total privatization of the Brazilian National Electric Company through a stock issuance, and the sale of various pieces of Petrobras, the oil company, to private companies. So Petrobras remains nationalized, but it's smaller. Now, what can we learn from this, from the Brazilian experience so far? First, the organized political power of Brazilian workers in their unions and the PT, the Workers' Party, was critical to defeat Bolsonaro and climate denialism. If there hadn't been a whole process over a generation of building workers' power in Brazil, Bolsonaro would be president today. Secondly, the nature of the Brazilian state's involvement in the Brazilian economy, the structures of the entrepreneurial state, expanded in earlier Workers' Party governments, created the financing opportunities and structures that more neoliberal states, and we'll come to one in a moment, do not have. It's possible, as a result, for Brazil to embrace ambitious climate targets, make investments commitments to back them up, and take strong action to protect the Amazon. Brazil has some level of flexibility. However, in the global high interest rate environment, Brazil is challenged to raise enough capital to move fast enough to replace oil and gas with renewable energy as a source of foreign exchange. There's no doubt that they'd like to do it. In fact, there are significant sort of voices within Petrobras itself that have visions of how Petrobras can transition. But where do they get the capital? This leaves the oil and gas industry at the center of Brazil's economy, which puts pressure on Brazil's announced Paris targets. Punchline: government engagement with workers and government leadership and even some money is not enough without enough money. And it's unclear that even countries as economically substantial as Brazil can do it alone. This is a profound lesson for multilateral institutions and for the US and Europe. Now we're going to come to, unfortunately, a sadder story. And this is what's happened in South Africa. South Africa is the world's 7th largest coal producer. Again, there are some big wealthy countries, China, the United States, much, much bigger. But South Africa is a significant coal producer. This is about the attempt to close a developing country's carbon energy sector. And as I talk about this, I want you to remember the German coal plan. Multi-stakeholder dialogue over a 2-year period, 80 billion euros in support for coal companies, coal miners, and coal-dependent communities. 80 billion. 80% of South African electricity comes from coal, mostly in plants in one province, Mpumalanga. More than 50,000 good jobs depend on the coal and coal electricity nexus in South Africa. And South Africa is a country plagued by unemployment and informal sector work. So good jobs are enormously, enormously important. South Africa has an effective electric power monopoly, Eskom, state-owned utility, with a long history of collective bargaining with its workers, a history rooted in the anti-apartheid movement and the post-apartheid settlement. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is a former president of the union that represents the coal miners, the National Union of Mine Workers. In 2021, when Cyril Ramaphosa was relatively new in power, he embraced, in dialogue with South Africa's foreign partners in the G7 and the G20 and the OECD and all that structure, he embraced something called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, the JETP, that envisioned a transition from coal to renewables in South Africa. The South African government worked up what the budget would be for doing this successfully from a social and economic perspective. They worked up a budget of $98 billion US. It's not that much different than what actually was spent by Germany to do essentially the same thing. They went to their international partners for help. They got 8.5 million, not billion. I'm sorry, these numbers are these are typos. They're not billion, they're million. They're million, I think. What's important, though, what's important is the ratio between what was asked for and what was got. And what was got was 8. 8. What did that mean? In the absence of adequate international funding, the South African renewables sector depends on private equity financing. Private equity financing requires double-digit equity returns. Double-digit equity returns meant that they paid substandard wages compared to what Eskom was paying, and they demanded as a contractual matter, and the government agreed, to higher power prices to the South African public, much higher power prices. The Mine Workers Union was not involved in the initial planning process. It was dominated by the foreign funders and the South African government, even though the South African government had a tradition of being close to the Mine Workers Union. Eskom, it turns out that incumbents have agendas and power. Eskom, threatened by the private power producers, made a coalition with the unions who were looking at essentially the loss of all of these jobs and the communities that were facing power shortages and higher power costs as a result of what the private operators were demanding. The first power plant shut down under the plan in a place called Komati in South Africa was perceived by all actors to have produced mass layoffs and substantial social costs. Today, as the photo shows, the JTEP, this plan for shutting down the South African power sector, is now facing labor and community opposition in South Africa and from international labor bodies and dissent inside Ramaphosa's government. Government ministers are saying they don't agree with the plan. The international labor movement is backing up the National Union of Mine Workers in their opposition to the plan. Industrial, the global federation of industrial and mining unions worldwide, supports the NUM in opposing the plan. It is unclear in this environment whether the plan will continue. This is a cautionary tale. Now, they may fix it. Cyril Ramaphosa is an extraordinary leader. He may fix this. It may be that the foreign funders will actually step up. But right now, the chain from not enough money to trying to get private capital to step up at double-digit rates of return, to trying to squeeze consumers and workers, is the clear alternative. It's the path, it's the dead end. If what I told you about the Biden administration and about Brazil is about how you more or less get it done, this is how you don't. Right? not because the Ramaphosa government wanted it this way, but because they got squeezed. Now, we're going to close with here, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom committed by law to net zero in 2050. With a Paris climate commitment at the Glasgow COP, which the United Kingdom took particularly seriously, obviously, of a 68% emissions reduction by 2030 as part of that pathway. But then, lo and behold, under Rishi Sunak, in the fall of 23, behind in the polls by 20%, the Conservative government postponed or altered a number of key climate policies, while at the same time campaigning against local government low-emission zones. Following these changes, the Independent Climate Change Committee, set up under law, so this is not like an NGO, this is a government body, set up under law, found that the government's plans after these changes remained, quote, insufficient to meet their own emissions targets, taking all recent developments into account. However, the committee pointed to the plans for decarbonizing Tata Steel as a sign of progress. Here is why, in that respect, they were mistaken. Tata Steel and the challenge of British climate policy. The Tata Steelworks in Port Talbot, Wales, are Britain's last basic steel mill, and they employ 3,000 unionized workers. What does it mean to be the last basic steel mill? Basic steel creates steel from iron ore and coke. The other kind of steel mill works from scrap, an electric arc furnace. Basic steel is there's various kinds of furnaces, but it's not electric arc. You can't make certain kinds of steel from scrap. High quality stuff, the kind that you need, for example, in munitions, tanks, ships, that kind of thing, has to be from a basic steel mill. So a basic steel mill has all kinds of implications, right? Cultural implications, national security implications. At the same time, the Tata Works in Port Talbot, Wales, are the single largest carbon emission source in the United Kingdom. Something has to be done about that. The question is how. The Conservative government gave Tata £500 million to replace its old coal-fired furnaces with state-of-the-art electric ones. That doesn't deal with this problem of what do you do if you actually need basic steel for national defense, but that was the plan. Tata took that money and created a 2-year total shutdown plan with the complete layoff of all of the workers and without any clear contractual commitment to bring them back. And Tata made clear that during this 2-year shutdown plan, it would meet the demand of its customers by importing steel from outside the UK that would be made in mills that had a higher carbon emissions content than Tata Steel in Port Talbot does today. Tata and the government ignored the union plan led by the GMB, the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union, the British Union plan that would have maintained half the employment through transition and would have not involved the importation of the steel, at least much less of it. What is the message of the Tata shutdown? The message is fighting climate change costs good jobs. Workers' voices won't be listened to in the process. Investment in new jobs will be token. There's a budget, the government funded £100 million for new jobs and layoff benefits. That's nothing. 3,000 people, capital investment per job, it's trivial. Again, remember the German coal deal. 80 billion euros for transition. Billion. In this case, I got my billions and millions right. These numbers are millions. The government won't help laid off workers. Nothing particular was promised by the Tories. And the net result will not be decarbonization. The net result will be that Tata gets to do whatever it does and make money however it wants, and the actual carbon emissions content of British steel will either remain the same or go up. And 2 years or 3 years from now, who knows? Now, these messages, ironically enough, are consistent with conservative political messaging post the 2023 by-elections, which they won on the ULEZ. And they are consistent with, in a strange sort of way, with conservative policy retreat on the climate goals that, of all people, Boris Johnson had championed. This whole melange of things, though, has not succeeded in restoring the conservatives to a competitive position in the polls. And so the question is, given what the current polls are, what will Labour do? If there is a new Labour government in the United Kingdom, it will have to address 15 years of economic stagnation and the conservative retreat on climate commitments I just mentioned. The current government budget, the conservative government budget, projects a substantial decrease in public investment in the later 2020s, from a baseline that is already below the OECD average. That is a plan for a catastrophe, not just a catastrophe in climate, but catastrophe in terms of the British economy and British competitiveness. Now, Labour's original plan was a $28 billion per year climate investment, which was actually $20 billion higher than current budget plans under the Tories. That is roughly 2/3 as much as the total Biden investment agenda as a percentage of GDP, but it was weighted more toward climate. In February 2024, Labour revised the plan to be $23 billion over 5 years of Parliament. Not $28 billion a year, but $23 billion over 5 years. This is about 1/3 of the Biden climate investment agenda as a percentage of GDP. Now, both as climate policy and as macroeconomic policy oriented towards growth, Labour's current plan appears inadequate against the backdrop of long-term shortfall in British public investment, related economic stagnation, and the urgency of the climate problem. Labour's current position is they're going to make this up by unleashing private capital. Now, that leaves the question, can Labour regain its climate ambition? There is a desperate need in this country, in the United Kingdom, to alter the politics of climate change, and particularly with respect to working people. Many working people pick up on the message that the Tata Steel closure sent. The Labour Party supported the trade union position on Tata Steel, much to its credit. Can that be broadened and leaned into politically in a way that generates enthusiasm for climate action in Labour's base? Labour has a strong workers' rights platform, worked out with the TUC and the major British trade unions. Will that be enough, or will climate investment-specific worker rights be needed? In Germany, climate investment-specific worker rights were unnecessary because German labor laws are strong. German trade unions are strong. The issue of whether or not new jobs were going to be union wasn't really very serious. Everybody assumed they would be. In the United States, it was absolutely necessary. And where it was absent, it provoked significant social conflict. Unclear what you need in this country. How will Labour deal with the fiscal constraints it has embraced when those constraints block growth and climate action? And finally, if Labour's position is that unlocking private investment is key, the US example, that hockey stick, right, in terms of manufacturing investment, suggests that unlocking private investment requires actual public money. Not talk, money. In conclusion, and you've all been very patient as I ran over, in conclusion, across all 4 countries, what do we see? A, the fight to control climate change is a fight about public investment. Working people's political power is key to winning that political fight if it is deployed on the side of action, of fighting. If working people's political power ends up being alienated from the climate fight, you get disaster. The key elements of getting working people's support for climate action are worker voice, public funding, and clear political leadership. But there is another key lesson. It's so key, I put it in red. In the current international financial system, only the strongest actors, the United States, Germany, China, have the fiscal space to invest at the levels needed to fight climate change and sustain political support in their societies for that fight. The world is bigger than the US, Germany, and China. And climate change is a global problem. Fundamental change in the global financial system, at least as it relates to climate-related investment, is essential and needed immediately if the world has any chance of meeting the Paris targets. This is a worldwide problem, and it needs a worldwide solution in terms of finance. That is the end of my talk. I will just say one thing, which is that next week I'm going to go give 2 talks about finance, about the financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. It's kind of related to what's in the red box. I can't promise you that I have an answer to what's in the red box, but I can tell you where the problem came from. And that's next week. Thank you very much. So Josh has kindly offered to be the maestro of questions. So
Thank you. Yeah. First, maybe opening it up to the room.
got 1, 2, 3, I think.
Pass it over here. We can pass the mic.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's very informative and a very calm approach to a very hectic topic. So I'm just wondering your views on conditionality in climate finance. So when you look at like the blended and the more indirect approach to taking through subsidies and tax incentives, is that, you think, a limitation put on them through, for example, the WTO? If the US talk about anti-dumping in China, if they go for more direct investment there, then kind of, if the US putting more direct investment into climate-related technology, is that limiting their sort of approach to WTO negotiations and issues there? And also with direct investment, it looks like most of the sort of expertise is in the private sector, so like due diligence, deal sourcing, and obviously on the other side of that, where is the expertise on conditionality coming from? So how would you, like, what does conditionality look like from climate if you're the US government? I'm sorry if that's like quite a convoluted question.
No, it's okay. I'm just not quite sure what the last phrase of it means. What do you mean by the expertise on conditionality?
So how would you get the administrative capacity in the US government to do the deal sourcing and do the due diligence and also have the create the conditionality?
For the essentially the business management expertise.
Yeah, I think so.
Right? The more directly involved you are in the activity, the more you actually have to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Is that the gist?
I think so.
Okay, all right. So let me try to answer. It's a very sophisticated question, and I will give an answer that I hope is sophisticated enough for the question. First, the WTO and the question of WTO compliance for public investment on climate. People who hate the WTO are always telling me that the WTO is a problem if you want to do X or Y or Z. And yet somehow when the world's major economies do X or Y or Z, you never hear from the WTO. I think there's an important lesson in power politics there. Right? I think that a lot of what I'm thinking of when I think about the need for very directed sort of public investment that's the entire capital stack in a given project. I'm thinking about things that actually are very marginally related to the WTO and the WTO rules. So for example, the most important thing that could be done in most societies is to decarbonize the power grid and to expand the power grid's capacity. Right? Now, we have both publicly and privately owned power grids around the world. It's not likely to cause you a lot of problems, however you finance that from a WTO perspective. Secondly, when it comes to things like automotive, the real need is to drive certain types of innovation that can be done through organizations like DARPA right, through research, that there's no question that is WTO compliant to be government funded, and through essentially market shaping exercises, which the WTO may or may not find to be violative of its rules, but it will take them years to figure that out. I think the issue of expertise is a really important one. I highly recommend to you my colleague Mariana Mazzucato's and Rosie Collington's book, The Big Con, which is about consulting firms, but it's really about the question of expertise in government. In much of the developed world, there is a problem of sort of diminished expertise in government. And the fight against climate change requires that expertise be rebuilt. Major governments, though, it turns out, do actually have a lot of expertise. It needs to be put to work. Right? And particularly, I think, a lot of the expertise that exists in the kind of defense context needs to be deployed into the climate context. And also a mentality, right? The mentality which exists in the defense sector of you get this done. Right? You don't ask how much profit is being made. You don't ask whether or not, you know, somebody's got an economic model that shows it's efficient or not. You get it done. And that's the mentality that we need to bring to climate.
Thank you, Damon. My question is a little bit is a question for you on your analysis of the long-term outlook for industrial relations in the U.S. context, and thinking about this in the context of a lot of the acts that you laid out are about rebuilding American competitiveness, especially with regards to the geopolitical fight with China, particularly the Chips and Science Act and also automotive and everything else. Where do you think the kind of uptick in labor militancy, workers' rights, wages is going to collide with corporate profitability and particularly like foreign companies, maybe especially in automotive, but others, then claiming a decline in viability for their operations to take place within the US, and therefore trying to squeeze the Biden administration and the workers to show restraint. And so my question is like, is there going to be a conflict that's going to happen with this kind of current apparent harmony between the unions and the administration if Biden continues because of kind of like macro or geopolitical concerns around exports and affordability of imports?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer can be seen sort of all around us right now. Volkswagen did not particularly intensely resist the unionization of its plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In fact, Republican politicians that dominate the state government of Tennessee, who really do not like the United Auto Workers, and that Republican politicians of their ilk have not liked the United Auto Workers since the United Auto Workers in its foundation made an alliance with the African-American community in Detroit in the mid-1930s. Right? The United Auto Workers has been symbolic of the labor movement in the South. The United Auto Workers, in particular as a union, has been symbolic of the U.S. labor movement's commitment to racial justice. And everybody understands this. And the Republican Party's politicians in Tennessee really don't like the UAW. And they tried to go into the plant in Chattanooga to try to persuade workers to vote no. Persuade being a polite term for what it was they were trying to do. And the VW management wouldn't let them in. Right? Now, why did that happen? The VW management doesn't view unionization as fundamentally a problem in terms of competitiveness. And that's partly because of their whole history in Germany and the fact that Volkswagen is the most co-determined of the major German firms. But it's also because labor content is not that big a component at this point of U.S. auto manufacture. Right? It's been automated and robotized and so forth to the point where labor is critical, but it's just the cost differentials aren't that great. Right? Companies don't like to pay, but they can be competitive and pay a living wage and benefits. But your question goes right to my slide about the need for market shaping in the United States, right? Because you know, China's everything is different than the United States is. And China's cost structures in relation to environmental issues, in relation to forced labor, in relation to all kinds of stuff is just completely different. And China's engaged in very active industrial policy of its own, which they have a perfect right to do, right? China's, by the way, such a large subject in this space that that would be a whole nother lecture, right? But if we want to hold together US society's support for an electric vehicle transition on a rapid time frame, because of some of the issues you're talking about, this has to be very actively managed, right? And we have to stop the notion of this kind of neoliberal thing of, well, we don't do subsidies. Well, for starters, we are doing subsidies. There's a $7,500 tax credit for every electric vehicle sold in the United States new. It may not be big enough, right? And we may not be doing it in the right way. Now that may seem really radical, but look into what portion of the US economy is the auto industry, is auto assembly. We can afford, as the United States, as Joe Biden used to say, we're the United States of America, we can afford to actually shape this industry in a way that gets to our climate goals. What we can't afford to do is not to. Do we have people online?
Yes.
All right, well, but we've handed the microphone off,
So,
and then
one from in person, then the last one will be our online question.
Thanks, Damon. I wanted to ask if your insights into the Democratic Party and the sort of left of American mainstream politics, are these sort of lessons that you're speaking of, the sort of criticisms or ways you could improve things like the IRA, are they being absorbed in the higher levels of policy making? So if Biden's successful in November, are we likely, or is it possible to see a more radically publicly funded climate, legislation come out?
I think that the observations that I made about the shortcomings of aspects of the Biden investment agenda, which are rooted in the sausage making of the legislative process. It's not how the Biden administration started, right, to some significant degree. I think these have definitely been absorbed by the American trade union movement. I think to a significant degree they've been absorbed by the environmental movement, who are alarmed about things like high interest rates shutting down wind development. I think there's going to definitely be a conversation about this should President Biden be reelected. I think there's going to be a conversation about it, whether he isn't or isn't, whether he is or isn't. The only problem is if he's not reelected, that conversation will happen when it may be too late.
Great. Yeah. For our last question, this definitely pertains to the question that came just before. So this one from William Harry. Where does the investment, particularly from things like the IRA, go when everyone already has a car, which can, exacerbate traffic? And how could it move on to other things? And in particular, is there already a vision for a future of the automotive industry that is thinking kind of post-car or post-individual car?
Okay. So the first thing to deal with is, yes, everybody has a car, but it's the wrong kind of car. Right? And the issue is changing. Is a changeover, right? That is the easiest way in terms of social disruption, right, to get a grip on a runaway climate catastrophe. In a more long-term way, the direction, I think, is you can see in the groundbreaking for high-speed rail between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, two capitals of car culture, by the way. It's a shocking fact that in 2008, right, China and the United States both did not have any high-speed rail. None. France had high-speed rail. Japan had a high-speed rail. Even the United Kingdom, in a funny kind of way, on the northeastern line, had something that Americans would think was high-speed. But the United States and China did not, the two world's largest economies. China committed to building high-speed rail in 2008. And so did President Obama in the United States when he came into office. 2012, or 2016, sometime around then, sometime in the mid-teens, China's high-speed rail network carried more passenger miles than the US airline system. And the United States had no high-speed rail. Now that's got to change, right? I'm not sure that will fully respond to the questioner's concerns, but it raises a larger issue, right, about climate policy and effective action on climate change. There are many people, and some of them have sat in this very room, there are many people who think that in order to stop climate change, we need to essentially transition from industrial society to something else, or from consumer society to something else. I am not going to express an opinion about what I think about whether industrial society is good or bad, or consumer society is good or bad, but I will express an opinion about politics. If you go to the public of any country, I don't mean just the United States or Britain or Germany or Abu Dhabi, some self-indulgent, affluent group of people. I mean, you go anywhere, and you say to people, you say to somebody who works on a farm with a tractor, and you have to think about, like, where does that tractor come from? What is required to have a tractor? You say to that farmer, I'm sorry, that's destroying the planet. Next year, do it with a hoe. Try that out. I don't mean try that out in Iowa or, in Surrey. Try that out in Tanzania. It's a non-starter. To fight climate change, we have to be able to say to people that the enormous transformation that industrial society has wrought in your way of life, in your health, in your physical well-being, in your amount of free time, in your degree of economic and physical security, those things are not at issue here. We will be able to deal with this problem within that framework. You are not being asked to go back and live as your great-great-grandfather did. That is essential to being able to win the fight against climate change. And the irony is that if we don't, it's not winning the fight against climate change that actually threatens the achievements of industrial civilization, because they are dependent on social and political stability that are going to be jeopardized profoundly by things like 1 billion refugees. Right? The real threat to a regression in our civilization is not fighting climate change. It's not fighting climate change. Are we done?